Denver, Colorado. Autumn, 1888. A single father walked into Miller's General Store carrying a hungry infant in one arm and a dented tin of milk in the other. Before winter ended, the wealthiest widow in Colorado would risk her fortune, her reputation, and her heart for the father and child standing before her. The wind followed Elias Thorne through the door, scattering dust across the old floorboards. His coat was thin. His boots were cracked. The baby against his chest was wrapped in a blanket worn nearly through. Near a shelf of imported teas stood Sarah Sterling. At 45, Sarah had more money than most men in Denver. She owned a mansion, silver shares, and enough land to see the mountains from every window. But after losing her only son many years earlier, she lived in a house that felt painfully empty. She noticed Elias because of the way he held the child. Not carelessly, not impatiently. He held the baby as though the small life in his arms was the last precious thing the world had left him. Sarah watched him from the shadows of the dry goods aisle. She saw the raw desperation in his bloodshot eyes. The man approached the heavy wooden counter. His steps were hesitant, heavy with shame. The shopkeeper was a man named Silas Miller. Silas wore spectacles perched on the very tip of his nose. He did not look up from his heavy leather ledger at first. He valued numbers more than human breath. "Back again, Elias?" Silas asked. His voice was flat, devoid of any human warmth. The man, Elias Thorne, did not answer immediately. He placed a small, heavy tin on the counter. The label was faded and torn at the edges. The faded label still read, "Condensed milk for infants." "I need you to take this back," Elias said. His voice was low and rough with exhaustion. Silas stopped writing and looked up slowly. He pushed his glasses higher on the bridge of his nose. "You bought that 3 days ago on credit, Elias." "I know I did," the man replied. He tightened his grip on the small bundle in his arms. "I cannot pay the balance," Elias admitted. "The mine dismissed half its men yesterday. I was one of them." Silas gave a humorless laugh. "This isn't a charity house, Thorne. I took a risk letting you have that tin on a promise. If I take it back now, I can't sell it for the full price. The seal is scratched and the tin is dented." Elias looked down at his boots. They were caked in thick, dried prairie mud. "Please, Silas." Elias looked down at his son. "He needs the milk." "But I need enough money for firewood tonight." His voice nearly broke. "If I keep the milk, he may freeze. If I return it, he may go hungry." The baby in his arms let out a thin, weak whimper. It was a high, fragile sound. It pierced the heart of every person in the room. Most of the patrons turned their heads away. They did not want to see the ugly face of poverty. They did not want to feel the guilt of their own comfort. But Sarah Sterling was truly listening. She saw the way Elias's hands shook. They were the hands of a true worker. They were calloused, scarred, and stained with the earth. Yet he held the infant with a tenderness that did not match his rough appearance. It was a sight that was almost too painful to witness. "No returns on opened or handled goods," Silas snapped. He slammed his ledger shut with a loud final thud. "Take your milk and get out of my store. Do not come back until you have real silver." Elias stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment. The humiliation radiated off him in waves of heat. He reached for the tin with white, shaking knuckles. The baby began to cry louder now. It was a desperate, hungry wail. The baby's cry reached a place inside Sarah that had been silent for 20 years. Her son, Leo, had died of scarlet fever before his 7th birthday. She still remembered the last night she held him. She remembered the silence afterward most of all. Sarah could not listen to another child cry while grown people looked away. Sarah stepped out from behind the towering shelves.
The rustle of her silk dress was like a sudden sharp breeze. "Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice was clear, cold, and commanding. It cut through the tension like a polished blade. The shopkeeper froze mid-motion. His hard expression changed the moment he recognized her. "Mrs. Sterling," he exclaimed.
"I didn't realize you were still in the aisle. How can I help you today, ma'am?" Sarah did not look at Silas. She kept her eyes fixed on the man in the worn wool coat. Elias looked at her with shock and deep ingrained wariness. He saw her expensive jewelry. He saw her perfectly styled dark hair. He saw a world of wealth he would never touch. "Put the milk back in the man's back," Sarah ordered. Silas stared at her in disbelief. "But, ma'am, he can't pay the debt." "I did not ask you about his balance," Sarah interrupted. She reached into her small velvet reticule. She pulled out a heavy, glittering gold coin. She laid it on the counter with a firm, echoing click. "This will cover his debt in full. It will also cover 6 more tins of that milk, enough to carry the boy safely through the coming winter, and 2 sacks of the best white flour you have, and the finest wool blankets in your back storeroom." The entire store went deathly silent. The other patrons stopped their whispering. The only sound was the crackle of the wood stove. Elias stared at the gold coin. He looked at it as if it were a fallen star. "No," he muttered, shaking his head slowly. "I don't take handouts, lady." Sarah turned to him fully. Her expression softened until the hardness left her eyes. "This is not charity, Mr.
Thorne," Sarah said. "It is help from one parent who knows what it means to lose a child." Her eyes moved to Samuel. "Winter does not care about pride. Tonight your son needs warmth more than you need to owe no one." Elias looked down at his crying son. The infant's face was bright red. His tiny fists were flailing against the old, thin blanket. The man's resolve finally crumbled. A single tear tracked through the soot on his cheek.
"I have nothing to give you in return," he whispered. "Then repay me by keeping him safe," Sarah said. "When you are able to work again, help someone who has less than you do." Silas hurried to gather the items. Elias quietly removed the flour from the crate. "The milk and 1 blanket are enough," he said. "I will not take more than Samuel needs." Sarah studied him for a moment. Most men she knew took everything they could reach. This man, who had almost nothing, was trying to leave something behind. Silas returned the flour to the shelf and packed the milk with 1 thick wool blanket. Sarah watched as Elias tried to lift the crate while still holding Samuel. He was still holding the baby tightly. He struggled as his exhaustion finally took hold. "Wait," Sarah said. "My carriage is waiting just outside. Let my driver take you to your home." Elias hesitated once more. The gap between their lives felt like the Grand Canyon. "I live in the shanties by the rail tracks," he said. "It is no place for a lady's carriage." "A carriage is just wood, leather, and wheels," Sarah said. "It goes exactly where it is told to go." She motioned for him to follow her. They walked out into the freezing Denver afternoon. The wind tried to push them back into the shadows. Her driver, Thomas, was waiting by the polished brougham. Thomas did not blink at the sight of the ragged man. He had served Sarah for many years. He knew her heart was finally waking up from its long sleep. He helped Elias into the plush velvet interior. Elias sat stiffly against the fine carriage cushions, afraid even to touch them. Sarah noticed his discomfort, but said nothing. As the carriage began to roll, the baby finally quieted. The warmth of the cabin acted like a soft lullaby. Elias looked out the window at the brick buildings passing by. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said quietly, "and this little one is Samuel." "I am Sarah," she replied. "Tell me your story, Elias." He told her about his wife, Martha. Martha had died after Samuel's birth in an isolated mining camp. The nearest doctor had arrived too late. He told her of his dream to own a small ranch. He wanted to be near the foothills. He had come west searching for gold. He found only hard labor and bitter, hollow loss. Sarah listened with her heart aching in her chest. She saw a man who had sacrificed everything. She saw a father drowning in a sea of bad luck.
When they reached the shanty town, Sarah was horrified. The houses were made of scrap metal and old crates. The wind blew straight through the gaps in the thin walls. Children played in the freezing mud without shoes. It was a landscape of forgotten souls. Elias got out, holding the crate and his son. "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling," he said. "I will find a way to repay this kindness." "Just keep him warm, Elias," she said. "That is the only payment I require." As the carriage drove away, Sarah looked back. She saw him standing in the gray, frozen mud. He was a lone, defiant figure against a bleak sky. She knew she could not just leave him there to rot. She crossed the silent hall and unlocked a room that had remained closed for 20 years. Leo's small wooden horse still stood on the mantel. His childhood coat still hung behind the door. Sarah lifted the framed photograph beside his bed. For one frightening moment, she wondered whether she was helping Samuel because she wanted to replace the son she had lost.
"No," she whispered into the empty room. No child could replace Leo. But loving his memory did not require her to ignore another child who needed help. She placed the photograph back on the table. Then she rang for Thomas. The next morning, she made a life-changing decision. It was a decision that would shock the entire city. She called for her lawyer and her estate manager. "I want to reopen the old foreman's cottage," she announced. "The one on the north ridge of the estate. And I want to hire a new groundskeeper immediately. But